Good morning, everyone. Thank you all very much for being here. On September 29th, 2015, the United Nations General Assembly established December 9 as the International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the Victims of Crime, of Genocide, and of the prevention of this crime. Today, healthcare workers globally have united to join our colleagues in Ramallah, Palestine, to convene press conferences across 4 continents and over 20 cities, demanding an end to this brutal genocide that's been happening in Gaza. Today marks day 429. December 9, 2024, today also marks the 76th anniversary of the 1948 Genocide Convention, which defines and criminalizes genocide. Just a few days ago, Amnesty International said, and I'm quoting, "Our research reveals that for months, Israel has persisted in committing genocidal acts, fully aware of the irreparable harm it was inflicting on the Palestinians in Gaza." The punishment has also been defined, and it's been going on for 429 days with impunity. This comes in wake of at least 52,000 people killed, 17,000 of them being children, 108,000 injured, over 10,000 healthcare workers killed, 1,200 injured. That's not to name and count all the ones who are not identified because they're either under the rubble or all their families have been wiped out, so there is nobody to identify them. Gaza healthcare system is systematically being destroyed through a series of attacks, and we're here to place some demands on our governments. With that, I will leave the microphone to Hala Rahid, who has been a diplomat for US for 18 years and resigned because she would not be complicit with this crime.
Good morning, everybody. How ironic that we stand here today on the commemoration of a day to honor the victims of genocides, when we have all been witnessing for over a year a live stream genocide on our phones. The irony of the fact that the Convention on Genocide Prevention launched in 1948, but yet today we, as citizens of the world, are not able to stop what is happening. And I can tell you, as someone that served the United States government for 18 years, someone that worked on diplomacy throughout the world on behalf of the United States government, I know why it's happening. It's when seemingly good people do nothing and choose to do nothing. When diplomats know and recognize and affirm that the US government is breaking US laws, is breaking international laws, yet choose to remain silent. So I have to say that it is an absolute honor for me today to be standing next to these heroes behind me and alongside all those around the world that chose to not only use their voice, but chose to use their bodies, their expertise, and actually go to Gaza and help those in need. And the fact that we're seeing such solidarity today in cities around the world gives me faith in humanity. But more needs to be done, because despite all of this solidarity, we're still seeing the ethnic cleansing of an entire population. We're seeing the forced starvation of an entire population. And yet, despite this, arms continue to flow. Now, I want to make one thing clear. We're focused today on international law, and that is absolutely critical because it's very clear on the prevention of genocide. But I want to add one more point, that this is all in violation of US law as well. And the politicians that sit not too far from here in Capitol Hill, they are willingly violating US law, as are members of the Biden-Harris administration. So for clarity, there are a few points that I want to make. There is Leahy law, which states that the US government is not authorized to send any military assistance to countries that commit gross human rights violations. There is ample evidence, not just from international organizations, but from US experts that have been silenced, documenting day after day, week after week, month after month, the gross human rights violations that are being perpetrated by the Israeli army in Gaza. Yet the arms continue to flow. There's also the Foreign Assistance Act, which states that the US government is not authorized to send military assistance to countries that inhibit humanitarian assistance from going to those in need. Yet again, we're seeing the absolute willful violation of this law when there is ample evidence documenting Israel's systematic blocking of humanitarian assistance to the point where the population of Gaza has been starved, malnourished, to the point for some of starvation to death, including children. How is this still happening? And again, I'll go back to the point of it happens because seemingly good people choose to do nothing. So on all those who are listening, watching, feeling helpless, be inspired by all those standing behind me. You don't have to go to Gaza, but use your voice. Call your representatives. Vote these politicians out. Insist that a human life is a human life, whether it's a Palestinian, an Israeli, or anyone else. That children cannot be targeted or considered collateral damage. Now, I'm honored to, on behalf of healthcare workers, list some of their demands. And I hope that all those listening will support these demands in their own right. First and foremost, at the very basic level, global healthcare workers demand an end to Israel's genocide in Gaza, an immediate end. In Washington, D.C., here, the group of healthcare workers are demanding a few very specific and clear-cut demands. A complete arms embargo on Israel. And I'll add, this is in line, again, with U.S. law. There are more that I didn't stipulate, but just the two that I already discussed should make this abundantly clear that it needs to be implemented as soon as possible. Next is this issuing of a statement opposing genocide by the American Medical Association and the American Nurses Association and the American Associations and Academies for Specialties. And when we again say that atrocities continue to happen throughout history, again and again and again, when seemingly good people choose to do nothing, this is an exact example of that. Why hasn't the AMA already made a statement? Why hasn't there been more unity from not just the healthcare profession, but every profession demanding an end to this genocide? Next, the creation and the expansion of a medical evacuation plan to support provision of life-saving medical aid to Palestinians in Gaza. The refunding and enhancing of UNRWA that is critical for humanitarian aid to reach people, the people of Palestine and Gaza, and this is life-saving aid that otherwise has no way of reaching those in need. diplomatic sanctions on the Israeli government and its military officials, again in line with international law, the recognition of the State of Palestine, and the respect and application of international law, including the ICJ's ruling in South Africa versus Israel, and the application of the ICC arrest warrants on the war criminals of Netanyahu and Gallant. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to these heroes behind me. Thank you.
I'd like to first introduce Dr. Adla Sukkar. She's an American Syrian physician. She's a practicing pulmonologist in the DC area and a member of Doctors Against Genocide. She's married to Dr. Tariq Haddad, a practicing cardiologist in the DC area who is originally from Gaza. She's here today to testify on behalf of Dr. Haddad's family who have been victims of this ongoing genocide.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Dr. Adla Sukkar. I'm happy to be here to bear witness to what my husband's family has suffered during this ongoing genocide. And I do want to emphasize that it's an ongoing genocide. As recently as the end of October, I unfortunately discovered on behalf of the family by scrolling on X that 11 more children in my husband's family had been killed. It's a tragic way to find out that more of your family has been killed and to have to be the one to deliver that news to your loved one and all of his extended family. But that's just one story. My husband's extended family has now, we've reached over 200 in his family who have been murdered. And when I thought about coming here today, I ironically had to filter through which stories I was going to tell because they are so numerous. And I kept thinking, well, can I just find the right story, the right tragedy to appeal to any of the people around us? Because so many of us up here feel ultimately let down. I have spent more days than I can tell you on Capitol Hill beseeching my elected officials to care. And quite simply, they don't, or they have other interests that outweigh their humanity. And they are choosing to honor those interests rather than their humanity. And so that's why we're here today. I've been let down by my medical associations and the institutions that we supposedly represent. So in thinking about which stories I would tell, I decided to focus on stories that clearly demonstrate that my husband's family's deaths were preventable, as well as demonstrating intent, because the most difficult part of proving genocide is to prove intent. And I want there to be no mistake. My husband's family was intentionally slaughtered. So I'm going to start with the story of his cousin Hani, who in the very beginning of all of this was in the northern part of Gaza City. He, along with his mother, his two sisters, and his Croatian wife, were killed when their family home was bombed. His mother was split into pieces, his sister as well. He was injured, and he died because no one was allowed to approach the home to evacuate him. He died slowly and painfully. It was preventable. Ultimately, the family has yet to be able to find the body of his Croatian wife, Vera, and what was buried were parts of his sisters, along with him. During the beginning as well, we had great fear for many of our family members who had small infant children. In particular, one of our cousins had newborn twins. They were just a few months old, and as you can imagine, at this age, they are reliant on their mother's breast milk. With lack of clean water, you can imagine that women become dehydrated and that they are unable to provide adequate breast milk for their young children who have no other means of nutrition. And when you couple that with limited access to clean water to provide an alternative like formula, you can imagine the predicament that these women and these young children are in. This is just one story. You could extrapolate that across all of Gaza and across all of these infants, and this is completely and utterly preventable. This was in the time of they will have no water, no food, no access. This was deliberate. I want to tell the story of our family that evacuated from the north as directed in a car caravan along what was deemed a safe route. My husband's cousin, his pregnant wife, and their 6 children were in these cars. Their cars were deliberately bombed. My husband's cousin and all of their children were killed. The only remaining survivor was his pregnant wife. She made it down to Rafah, and she delivered that infant in dire circumstances without proper access to hospital care and care for the newborn infant. And that infant froze to death in a tent on the Rafah border. Sorry. Just this summer, my husband's cousin's son, 14, ventured out on behalf of his family to get bread, because that's what's available, bread. He was targeted by a drone. He was alone. I also discovered his death on social media as he lay in the street with pita bread surrounding him, bloodstained. The last story I'm going to tell is of some extended relatives. 3 elderly aunts in the extended family, on their own, in part of Gaza City, were approached by the IOF forces at 4:30 in the morning. 2 of the sisters came to the door and were shot on sight. The 3rd sister, wheelchair bound, was shot in the arm and injured. They left her there. She managed to call her family. The family was not allowed to approach the house to evacuate her, to retrieve the bodies of her sisters. We have 3 days of voice recordings of her slowly dying. She ultimately passed away from a preventable injury in the presence of her 2 deceased sisters who had been slaughtered. The family contacted the Israeli forces to let them know, well, now our aunt has died. Can we please retrieve the bodies of our loved ones? They burned the house down. So what was left was her wheelchair. That's it. So if that doesn't demonstrate intent, I don't know what does. This was a genocide months ago. It's a genocide last week. It's a genocide now. And it is utterly preventable, and it needs to stop. And my husband's family is just one family. There are countless stories, and it is my hope that my husband's family did not die in vain, that whomever will die moving forward, because this genocide is not over, will not die in vain, and that their testimonies and the testimonies of so many other families will be used in The Hague to bring these the people who have perpetrated this genocide to justice. Thanks.
I'd next like to introduce Nurse Lana. She went on a medical mission trip to Gaza 10 months ago. She was one of the first U.S. nurses to take a trip to Gaza on a medical mission during this genocide. She provided care to hundreds of internally displaced Palestinians and tended to the wounded.
Hello, my name is Lana, and I'm not a public speaker. I don't belong in front of a podium. I am a nurse, and I belong at the bedside right now, actually. I'm supposed to be at work. But here I am for the 27th time to tell you about the honor and privilege, as well as the heartbreak of serving as a medical mission nurse in Gaza about 10 months ago. As a nurse, I took an oath to stand by those in need. But what I witnessed in Gaza wasn't just a humanitarian crisis, and it wasn't a war, it was genocide. I witnessed the repercussions of 85,000 tons of bombs dropped on a population of 2 million people the size of Washington, D.C. I stood among a sea of hundreds of thousands of homeless civilians. I saw families that were shredded apart and a landscape reduced to rubble. This is all part of a calculated campaign to erase a people. Israel has murdered 250,000 people within a year. I do want to say, as a witness to Gaza's destruction, the most important voices and testimonies should be from the people of Gaza. They should be the ones standing here to speak their truth. But their voices have been silenced through bombs, through blockades, through oppression, through propaganda, through media bans. So now it's become my moral obligation to speak on their behalf as a witness. Today, there are 0 fully functioning hospitals available in Gaza. 0. Every single hospital has been bombed or cut off from supplies or electricity. I treated patients who arrived in relentless waves, many too far gone to save, and it wasn't because we lacked skill or compassion, but it was because of the level of violence combined with Israel's blockade on aid that collapsed the infrastructure of the healthcare system there. Doctors and nurses were forced to make difficult decisions, choosing which lives to save and which to let go, not because they lacked the will, but because the world allows Israel's inhumane blockade and bombardment to continue. Hospitals already under siege were running on fumes. No supplies, no electricity, no medicine, little to no staff, barely even having the space to grieve, let alone bury their dead. Israel has deliberately killed over 1,000 healthcare workers. Some were even raped and tortured to death. This Holocaust is being live streamed in real time online, and the Israeli forces have no shame in boasting about it on TikTok. Yet the world remains silent. Despite the horror and devastation I've witnessed, I've also witnessed an unbreakable resilience and humanity. The people of Gaza held on to their humanity with a strength that humbled me. I worked alongside healthcare heroes who continued to save lives even after losing their own spouses, children, siblings, parents in a single airstrike. And while grieving their own losses, they continued to show up every day, determined to save one life, even if that meant costing them their own. Exhausted doctors and nurses, also victims of genocide, consistently offered me their last scraps of food in the midst of famine. I've never met a more selfless and generous group of people. But let me be clear, their resilience does not absolve us from taking action. This is not just about Gaza. It's also about the silence that threatens all of us. What is happening in Gaza isn't just a tragedy for Palestinians. It is a threat and a warning to all of us. It is a litmus test. What we allow to happen there gives Israel and any other oppressor encouraged by our silence the green light to carry out similar atrocities elsewhere. I cannot unsee what I saw, and you should not unhear what I'm telling you guys. To my fellow healthcare workers who remain silent in the face of this Holocaust, where's your humanity? How can you turn away while an entire population is denied the right to life? You took the same oath that I took to preserve life and to do no harm, but your silence betrays that oath. Silence in the face of genocide is complicity. The world must not look away as Gaza bleeds. This is not just Gaza's fight, it is the world's fight. The time to act was a year ago. The future will judge us by how we respond to this moment. So be the one to stand up and not stand by. Demand a ceasefire now, demand justice now, because if we fail Gaza, we fail humanity. And that's all I've got to say.
Our next speaker is Dr. Hina Syed. She is an American physician born in Pakistan. She's an internal medicine and geriatric medicine specialist. She works with Humanity Axelim's medical team that served in Gaza in April 2024.
Good morning. Thank you for being here and listening to what we have to share. My name is Hina Syed, H-I-N-A. Last name is S-Y-E-D, and I am a witness to genocide in Gaza. This is a fact, and the world must bear witness. I went to Gaza in April when the Rafah border crossing was still open, and aid was barely trickling in. I will never forget miles and miles of trucks lined up at the border, full of desperately needed food and medical supplies. And they sat there, the trucks just sat there, unmoving, while just a couple of miles down the road inside Gaza, there were people just struggling to survive, thirsty, hungry, and afraid, and just depending on those medical supplies. The day after we arrived in Gaza, the world woke up to the horrifying news that 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers had been assassinated by Israel on the very roads that we had traveled on just hours earlier. We passed through the same stretch of darkness the night before that they had, unaware the tragedy would strike just a couple of hours afterwards. It was a chilling reminder for us that in Gaza, no place is safe, and even the simple act of helping and delivering aid could be a death sentence. And I ask, has anything changed after that? Has the world's collective grief ever translated into meaningful action? Or are these lives, not numbers, not stories, but are these lives just considered as collateral damage? Despite global outrage and condemnation of Israel's attacks, the killing of aid workers, healthcare workers, journalists, and this genocide continues unabated. As we speak, Israel continues to bomb and attack patients within the hospitals, Kamal Adwan Hospital and Indonesian Hospital in Gaza. Just a couple of days ago, last Friday, I still remember pictures of that young 16-year-old Mahmoud. He was on his way to get an X-ray in Kamal Adwan Hospital. He was attacked by Israeli quadcopters, shot multiple times, and I still remember that photograph. His lifeless, blood-soaked body slumped in a wheelchair. In what world and in what life is this ever acceptable? Where is the humanity, and how do you justify this? Would it be justified in this country? I worked in central Gaza in Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah. Every day casualties just poured into the ER, sometimes in waves and at times endlessly. The hospital was overwhelmed with not just wounded patients, but with displaced families whose homes had been destroyed already. Among the injured were children mostly, innocent, terrified, and scared. I remember a child, barely a teenager, with gunshot wounds to his neck, both entry and exit wounds, his malnourished body just slipping, and his life just slipping away from us. I remember a woman whose house was bombed, and her brain was just splattered on the ER floor. I remember children whose limbs had been targeted. They were left with no choice but to go through amputations, with not effective post-op care or effective post-op medications. In the hospitals, there were no beds left, there was no space, not even an inch of space. I watched patients vomit, bleed, and die on the cold ER crowded floors, which was a place that was meant to save them and heal them. It is genocide. I remember the nights, the relentless hum of drones circling above us, the deafening blasts nearby, and the ground trembling beneath my feet. And through it all, I remember patients crying out in the middle of the night, just screaming for pain medicines because we didn't have enough. Their pain was endless, and so is their suffering. There is one story that will stay with me forever. I'm a mother of 2 children, and my youngest son is 19-year-old. This was a woman who was brought to me in the ER. She was very unresponsive. She was still, except for just trembling of one of her hands. The lab work that we could do, that we had access to, and her vitals were stable, but she didn't respond to anything we were doing. Her family was frantic and eventually shared her story. About 30 days previously, her house had been bombed, and her 19-year-old son had gone to check on that home. He never returned. The family was, of course, very worried about him, but they clung on to hope. The day she was brought to the ER in front of us, the family decided to go back and check on their home. And there, when they went there, among the ruins, they found a body. decomposing body, same hair, same build. He was her son. And his life stolen, his body abandoned and decomposed. And what she saw, she just couldn't process, she couldn't endure that, and she just collapsed thereafter. This is not one story. And again, they're not stories, they're humans. It's thousands and thousands of fathers, mothers, sons and daughters whose lives have been reduced to statistics the world just seems to ignore. People of Gaza, they're not numbers, they're human beings like you and I. They survive not because they are strong, but because they're forced to do that, because they have no choice whatsoever. They feel pain, hunger, grief, just like you and I would, and they bleed red just like you and I do. I will finish off with this. This is one of the medical students. Her name is Sajida, I worked with in Gaza, and she sent me this message yesterday. And I'll quote her. She said, "We have been living through the worst period of our lives for over a year. Our days are consumed by constant fear of whether we will have anything to eat today, fear that we will die at any moment, that we will lose our loved ones in the next attack. And even in death, we are terrified. Will it be quick, or will they enjoy burning us while cheering them on? In Gaza, there is no escape from death except death in itself." She asks, "Is it reasonable, is it acceptable that my only concern in life right now is to escape death, hunger, disease, and explosions?" End quote. And this is exactly what genocide looks like. It is not just bombs falling from the sky. It is the destruction of every shred of normalcy that is possible, every basic human need stripped away from them, until survival itself becomes an unattainable dream. The world cannot look away. The leaders of this world, this country, President Biden, incoming President Trump, and other so-called leaders of this world cannot look away. Paralyzed by indifference or empty rhetoric, they must act now. It's already too late. Their inaction fuels the suffering, and they are complicit in this genocide. The responsibility to end these atrocities rests squarely on their shoulders. Enough is enough. Thank you.
Our next eyewitness speaker is Dr. Razan Al-Nahas. She is an emergency medicine physician in the DC area who has been practicing for nearly a decade. She is a part of Doctors Against Genocide, and she has recently returned after spending 5 weeks in Gaza, tending to the injured and serving in emergency hospitals.
Hello everyone, my name is Razan Al-Nahas. I'm an emergency medicine physician. I recently returned from a 5-week mission working at the Aqsa al-Shuhada Hospital in Gaza. During those 5 weeks, without a doubt, I was a witness to genocide and the calculated annihilation of an entire society. Any humanitarian aid worker or healthcare worker who has served in Gaza in the past 14 months will tell you the same. From the moment I entered Gaza, I was struck by the sheer magnitude of destruction. Entire cities were leveled. Any buildings that were still standing bore clear evidence of immense damage. It was apparent that the so-called targeted strikes were not targeted as the Israeli military claims. The destruction I witnessed in Gaza was the consequence of the indiscriminate obliteration of entire cities and their infrastructure. As I began my work at the hospital, it wasn't long before I personally experienced the direct targeting of healthcare facilities. This targeting of hospitals and clinics has pushed the healthcare system in Gaza to essential collapse. The few remaining hospitals are severely overwhelmed, with the strain on medical resources further compounded due to mass displacement of people into the central area of Gaza. Al-Aqsa Hospital, a small 200-bed hospital, is now caring for a population of over 1.2 million. There's a shortage of every medication and medical supply you can think of. Soap, gloves, ventilators, monitors, defibrillators. Restrictions imposed by Israeli authorities even meant that I, as a medical provider, was not permitted to bring with me to Gaza any of the scarce and needed medications or medical supplies. There is not even a CT scanner available at the hospital I worked at. Patients needed to be transferred to a different hospital just to receive scans, putting them at risk of decline while in transit or becoming the target of yet another Israeli airstrike while in the ambulance. Every day, we are treating victims of Israeli airstrikes. Most of the patients brought to the hospital for injuries by those strikes were children. With every airstrike, entire family lines are being injured or killed. I soon came to the realization that when we received large numbers of trauma patients, the patients often were related to one another and were the remaining survivors of the airstrikes. But if only a few patients arrived together, it meant the rest of the family had already perished. I'll never forget Mirad, a beautiful 6-year-old, trapped under the rubble after an Israeli airstrike. The strike happened at 7 p.m. Paramedics could not reach her until nearly 12 hours later due to continuous targeting of the area. She arrived to the hospital the next morning. She was alone at the hospital. Miral had been orphaned in that airstrike. She suffered a severe crush injury to her leg, and due to the delay in treatment, her leg had to be amputated. Who will care for her now? No mother, no father, no siblings. Her loss is beyond words. She is just one example. I lost count of the children we treated, often on the floor because there was no space left in the hospital. Most of these children died, either immediately from their injuries or days later from infections. Without proper resources, there was nothing we could do to save their lives, despite our best efforts. Beyond traumatic injuries, I saw patients dying from treatable illnesses. Diabetics died from diabetic ketoacidosis because they lacked insulin. Cancer patients faced worsening disease with no access to treatment. Pregnant women suffered complications due to the lack of prenatal care. Renal patients dying due to lack of access to dialysis. It was devastating to watch so many patients die of conditions I knew I could have treated if only I had the proper resources. Each death was a preventable tragedy, a consequence of a calculated, systematic deprivation meant to erase a population. Every person I met in Gaza, without exception, had been displaced multiple times, 7, 8, 9 times, sometimes more. They are living in tents, oftentimes makeshift tents, with only sheets or curtains separating them from the elements. No reliable access to water, and sewage flooding the streets. The spread of communicable and infectious disease is rampant. After over a year of war and displacement, the clothes and shoes people initially left their homes with are now worn. It was a common sight to see children barefoot. As the nights grew colder during my time there, I dreaded what winter would bring. I fear many children in Gaza will die of hypothermia. The famine and starvation in Gaza only continues, with the continued blockade of aid entry. I witnessed this firsthand. There is no amount of meaningful aid entering Gaza. Feeding one's family is a daily struggle. Markets are sparse, prices are inflated. The cost of a 25-kilogram bag of flour rose from an already unaffordable $100 to $400 in my time there. The blockade is deliberate. Before the war, 508 trucks entered Gaza daily. During my time there, some days, not even 5 trucks crossed into Gaza. While working at Al-Aqsa Hospital, I met Dr. Sally. Dr. Sally is an ICU physician who had been displaced multiple times with her husband, also a physician, and their 3 children. Her eyes welled with tears as she shared with me her greatest anguish. More than the bombs, more than the drones, more than the shootings, what tormented Dr. Sally the most was her daily struggle of figuring out how and what she was going to feed her 3 young children. This struggle is consistent among all those living in Gaza. I could speak for hours and hours about the devastation I witnessed and still not scratch the surface. We as Americans have not only allowed this massacre to continue for over a year, but we are complicit by funding and arming this genocide, despite it being a breach of existing U.S. law. Those of us that have gone to Gaza, we serve as first-hand witnesses of the reality on the ground, as even foreign journalists and investigators have been unprecedentedly banned from entering. Our testimonies are irrefutable. The reports from medical workers that have volunteered in Gaza are consistent. Those who have not been to Gaza have no basis to contradict what we have seen firsthand. There is no debate to be had between people who have been there, medical volunteers from all around the world who have shared consistent reports, with those who have not. If anyone from anywhere in the world could go and see what I saw, they would with no doubt reach the same conclusion as we have. This is genocide. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Zahid Rahman. He is a critical care nurse of 15 years in the DC area and completed a mission to Gaza through the Palestinian American Medical Association, where he managed patients in clinics, in the ICU, in the ER, in the operating room at European Gaza Hospital for 2 weeks.
Today I stand before you guys with a heavy heart, bearing witness to the unimaginable struggles faced by the people of Gaza. This past March, I had the privilege of serving as a humanitarian healthcare worker in this besieged territory. My experience there has left an indelible mark on my soul, and I'm compelled to share it with you guys today. Gaza is a place where hope and despair coexist. I saw firsthand the devastating impact of genocide, poverty, lack of access to basic necessities like healthcare, water, and sanitation. The hospital I worked in was overcrowded, understaffed, and struggling to cope with the influx of the wounded and the sick. I also witnessed the resilience of the Palestinian people, who, despite facing unimaginable hardships, continue to show remarkable courage and determination. As a healthcare worker, I was deeply moved by the stories of loss, suffering, and resilience. As a critical care nurse and a father of 3, I would never want my children to experience what the children of Gaza have been experiencing for over a year, which Amnesty International just recently called a genocide. Genocide now has a face, and I saw it in Gaza. Everyone is now talking about Syria, but I can't stop thinking about what I witnessed when I was in Gaza, where I saw at least 3 children assassinated by Israel. I'll never forget a 13-year-old girl. A 13-year-old girl who Israeli soldiers shot in the abdomen while she was playing outside. I'll never forget the 17-year-old Palestinian boy who was also shot in the abdomen by Israeli soldiers and was bleeding out due to the shrapnel left in his body, and my job was to try to keep him alive. I'll never forget the 14-month-old baby burned by Israel with 3rd-degree burns, and she died while she was on life support. I'll also never forget seeing 2 Palestinian boys trying to dig their family out of rubble after Israel bombed their home. I'll never forget hungry families in Gaza trying to share the little food that they had with me while Israel was bombing all the food aid trucks. I'll never forget Israel's destruction of people's homes, schools, and businesses. I videotaped some of this while I was out there myself. And people said it was bad, but it was actually worse. I have a friend, I'm going to leave her name out. She's also a nurse at European Gaza Hospital. She lost a younger brother when the family was forced to move multiple times due to displacement, and they no longer know where he's at or how he's doing. They don't know if he's alive or if he's dead. It's the face of a child who's lost their parents, their home, and their sense of security. It's the face of the mother who has chosen, who has to choose between buying food or medicine for her sick child when there is aid or food or medicine available. It's the face of a father who has lost his livelihood and his dignity. Genocide right now is not just a concept. It's a harsh reality that has ravaged the lives of innocent people. Gaza's crisis is not just a humanitarian issue, but a moral imperative. We must acknowledge the inherent dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of nationality, religion, or politics. We must demand action from our leaders to lift the blockade, ensure access to basic necessities, and support the rebuilding of infrastructure. We must recognize the critical role of humanitarian workers who risk their lives to provide care in the most challenging conditions. As I stand before you today, I urge you to remember the faces, the stories, and the struggles of people of Gaza. Let us work together to break the silence, challenge the status quo, and advocate for justice, compassion, and humanity. The people of Gaza deserve our solidarity, our voices, and our actions. We must be the voice for the voiceless, and we must act now. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes.
Thank you all for doing this. Really appreciate it. Some powerful stories. Can some of you talk about sort of all these narratives that you talked about, these powerful stories that you've witnessed, why you feel Americans, members of Congress, aren't doing more, aren't acting to the things that many of you have seen in person? You can all speak to it if you want to start, and whoever wants to answer.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. I've spoken to a lot of staffers. I think there's a very powerful lobby in town. And I think it's as simple as that. I think that behind closed doors, some of these people have souls and have some humanity left in them, what DC has not sucked out of them yet. But I think that there are very powerful forces at play, including our military-industrial complex, that it's not worth it. Humanity is not worth it. And there's going to be blowback. I've had that conversation with my elected officials. I think that we're behaving in a way that speaks to our nation's arrogance. It speaks to our feeling that we are not ever going to face consequences. I say that as somebody who was in a hospital that evacuated patients in order to make room for what we hoped were going to be survivors after 9/11. Okay? So I hope that that day doesn't come again. But I just think that we're acting from a place of impunity, from a place of others' interests, and we don't think there's going to be a price to pay. And we measure that in resources and dollar signs, and we're not measuring our futures by our morality, by the futures of our children and our grandchildren. And I'll tell you, I mean, I'm midlife, lived a good life. I am absolutely terrified for what my children are going to face in this country moving forward. Not just the kind of lack of freedom they're going to experience because of the erosion of even our abilities to speak out when we see things that are wrong. I mean, I'm not here talking about what institution I work for. There's a reason for that. I worry about what sort of experiences they're going to have on college campuses. I worry about what careers they'll take. I worry about what sort of life they're going to face. And of course, I worry about what our foreign policy will mean. We have a penchant for loving certain rulers around the world as long as they fit our interests. And then we love them, and then we hate them, and then we love them again. And we're seeing that play out. And there's a price to pay, and we're going to pay the price.
Spoken about blowback, and I'm wondering if any of the medical professionals up here, while I know your experience is slightly different, any of the medical professionals can talk about any kind of blowback that you've suffered professionally, any kind of accumulations you face as a result of your testimony here, and then
I personally haven't yet, but I do know of 2 people who have lost their jobs. I'm not going to give their names. Those are their stories to tell.
Sadly, we're afraid to speak on it, right? Because we don't want to be victims. So I think that's sad right there. Other job.
Can I answer your question?
Sure, and I have another follow-up for you as well.
So I'm gonna be very blunt. Again, as someone who worked inside government for 18 years, there's profit in war. That's the bottom line. And if you look at our nation's recent history, it's been war after war after war after war. But why? Because weapons need to be sold. I worked at the U.S. Embassy in Doha, Qatar, and I saw the weapon sales. I also saw Leahy vetting law being applied, right? There is supposed to be a systems of checks and balances where there is profit from war, but at the same time, you are supposed to enforce human rights laws. That is non-existent right now because of various issues, including Citizens United, which basically allows dark money into our political system, that at this point there is institutionalized corruption in the United States. As an American diplomat, I was never allowed to get any type of donations. Me and all other diplomats were an open book. Yet the politicians that are deciding whether or not arms are sent to Israel directly profit from campaign contributions. And not just AIPAC, the broader pro-Israeli lobby, but also the arms industry. And when you have the pro-Israeli lobby and the arms industry together, it is an absolutely lethal combination. Where I have also walked the halls of Congress, and behind closed doors, people will tell you, we know we're violating U.S. law. Is this the United States of America? Where our elected representatives are admitting that we're violating U.S. law, yet they'll continue to do it? But I want to take it one step further. It's easy to point to the politicians, but we have to take it back to the individual as well. As a diplomat, my coworkers chose to stay silent. They saw what was happening. They understood the gravity of the situation. They also knew that fundamentally, this was a failed policy. It wasn't keeping Israel any safer. It was causing a generational cycle of violence that ensures a destabilized Middle East for years and years to come. They know it. Yet, for their own career advancement, and I'm going to be blunt, for their own career advancement, they'll go along. This is why I'm so inspired by everybody here today. Because there are times in history where you cannot go along. This is why the Genocide Convention was written. For moments like this. Yet the fact that the vast majority choose to go along, choose to stay silent, whether it's for a promotion or to pay their mortgage or whatever it may be, is exactly why atrocities in the past were able to happen.
Well, just to follow up, do you think there will be a change with the incoming Trump administration? I know that you resigned from the Biden administration.
Yeah.
Do you feel as though, and anyone else who wants to address this as well, do you think that the Trump administration will have a different policy that you can get behind that will illustrate and perhaps challenge this thinking that Americans and others on Capitol Hill seem to have?
Look, I can't pretend, and I think anyone that tries to pretend what President-elect Trump is going to do is just fooling themselves. I think he's an unpredictable character, and I served under him when I was the head of the political economic section in South Africa in our U.S. consulate in Durban, and he is an unpredictable individual. I can tell you that one of the things that I was reporting on significantly when I was still in the State Department is the fact that this policy, talking about blowback, is a threat to U.S. national security. It is a threat to our diplomats serving overseas. It is a threat to our troops. We saw 3 members of the Department of Defense killed in Jordan. So when we as diplomats were saying this is a threat to the United States, why are you putting the interest of a foreign extremist government ahead of that of the American people? That was going to deaf ears. So I'm holding out a little hope that perhaps the new administration will take, if not the fact that it is a genocide, at least the fact that it is a threat to U.S. national security more seriously, even for that level of interest to try to act. Anything else?
I just have one more question. It's, Dr. Razan, if you could address this, because you've been there and anyone else who's been to Gaza witnessed this. What would you say to Americans who are spot, who don't believe this, who think that these are exaggerations of things that you've seen? Because I've done reporting on this for several months, and there are people who say these things. What do you say to them directly for what you've witnessed and seen as a doctor on the ground there? What do you say to those people who have these doubts?
This is the most live-streamed genocide conflict in history. And the things that I witnessed, I knew these things were happening before I went. But now that I have gone, as have many of my colleagues, we cannot refute this. We cannot say that this is not happening. And I'm honestly at a loss of words for people that will continue to deny that this is actually occurring, or that these stories are fallacies. I mean, I literally took care of babies in diapers on the floor and was unable to save their lives. These families that have been displaced, the doctor that I mentioned, she's actually only a few months younger than myself. She lived in a beautiful home prior to the start of the war. I feel like there was no difference between her and I. Like, why is her life any less valuable than mine? Why should she be subjected to this? And I think that people who are until this point still refusing to believe or understand, I think they're choosing to be ignorant, and they're choosing to be blind. That's a personal choice. I actually can't comprehend it, and I can't understand it, and I don't know what more we can say to make it very clear that this is real, that this is a genocide, that, you know, tens of thousands of people have been murdered, and, you know, millions displaced, and it will continue if we don't put an end to it yesterday. And I don't know if anyone else has anything else to say to this. I actually feel like there's not much for me to say to people who are choosing to be blind.
I say go there for yourself and see it. Go. And if you can't get in, ask yourself why. Why won't Israel let press in? Go there for yourself if you don't believe it. And that's what I say to the ones who don't believe that this is happening.
You asked, why doesn't the average American believe that it's real? I can tell you for a fact, while I was there, I had moments where I left the hospital, and when I did, it was for one purpose and one purpose only, was to actually see with my own eyes what the American public is seeing, but they don't believe. The things I saw, the things I smelled, the sounds that I heard, they changed from location to location. The hospital was deemed to be a safe area. Despite that, there were still drones everywhere. As soon as you left the hospital area and you went out into the community, you smelled sewage, because there's no more sanitation. You smelled garbage because no one's picking up the garbage. And then at some point, you get far enough to where you have buildings that have been destroyed, bodies that have not been recovered, and you smell decaying flesh. Those are things that I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my life. This genocide is real. It's undoubtedly real. And for the average American who doesn't believe this, I'm not sure what else we can do. As healthcare workers here, you guys trust us to take care of you guys when you are our patients. You have to trust our word when we tell you what we've seen, what we've smelled, what we've done while we were in Gaza. It just doesn't make any sense to not believe us.
If I can just add one thing to those very, very powerful words, it's racism as well. And I want to be clear that it's at the subconscious level, that people don't realize their racism, that unfortunately in this country there has been such an institutionalized and embedded dehumanization of Muslims, of Arabs, of Palestinians, that it is almost as if, well, there are always wars over there. People over there are always getting killed. The value of life is not seen the same. And again, I want to stress that it's at the subconscious level, because I speak to many people who are friends that are not impacted in the same way. And so when I keep repeating the words, when seemingly good people choose to stay silent, this is what happens. And so when I was in the department, part of my job was to send reports of what was happening inside Gaza to Washington. And I would put images of the dead babies. Horrific pictures of toddlers that were skin and bones. Yet the reactions that I was receiving were never equal to the reactions that I got when I was speaking about a Ukrainian child that was injured in Kyiv. The outrage, the horror of what was happening in Ukraine that I experienced as a diplomat from within the State Department was starkly different than the reaction that I was receiving when I was speaking to the same colleagues about what was happening in Gaza. So what's the difference? These are both children. These are both equal human lives. Why are you okay with this, yet you're not okay with that? And so I asked the American people to do some soul searching, to do some serious soul searching. Ask yourself, how do I react when I see these images? How does my heart react when I see these images? And if you see yourself not reacting in a humane way, do some soul searching. This is a point in history when we all need to do that. So I'll just wanted to add that point.
Add something to
Yeah,
that. Literally
absolutely.
2 days ago, I met a staffer, and I was talking to them about getting an appointment, maybe with the senator, with a few other doctors who have been to Gaza. And this staffer literally told me, if you request an appointment with a senator and mention the word Gaza or Palestine, you're not going to get the appointment. He was like, maybe talk about Ukraine. If you say Ukraine, you'll get in. He literally told me this just 2 days ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just add that the American Medical Association came out very quickly with the start of hostilities with Ukraine. They gathered very quickly $100,000 worth of medical supplies. They came out with condemnation statements very quickly. AMA has been utterly silent and have shut down efforts, some of which my group has been part of, to try and get any sort of statement out, okay? And to your point, it's racism, okay? There are a lot of political things in the background as well, but that's also inherent in what's happening. A Muslim child, an Arab child, a child that doesn't look blonde and white does not get the same kind of sympathy. And I've got news for everybody. You know, I invite the American public, you want to see what, not that it should matter, but Arabs are very diverse, okay? It's ridiculous that it should take someone like my child, who just so happens to be blonde and blue-eyed, but guess what? He's Arab by ethnicity, okay? Would that have helped? It shouldn't take something like that. But that's unfortunately the situation we find ourselves in.
I want to clarify, you said your husband's lost 200 relatives?
If you include extended family, we are at over 200. We have shown photos, okay? I mean, I don't know what more it's going to take. I don't know.
I just want to add one point.
that it's bad enough that, and the worst thing possible, that they're going through what they're going through, the genocide, but they have to prove, and they have to actually battle this dehumanization, and they have to prove that they're actually being killed the way they are. It's just very sad.